Hello and welcome to our latest online event as part of the IFS Deaton Review into Inequalities in the 21st Century. I'm Richard Blundell, Director of the Research Centre in Public Policy at IFS and a panel member of the IFS Deaton Review. Today our focus is on gender and inequality, in particular men and women at work, with an intriguing question as a subtitle. The more things change, the more things stay the same. We're going to hear from three leading experts who have been working with us at the IFS Deaton Review. We have Alison Andrew, a senior research economist at IFS and a co-author of the report that was launched today, which is part of our evidence gathering in the IFS Deaton Review. And I assure you it makes for some stunning, if somewhat depressing, reading. After hearing from Alison, we're going to turn to Fran Bennett. Fran is Associate Fellow at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. And she's, among many things, a member of the Policy Advisory Group of the Women's Budget Group. And Fran has written for us a commentary as part of the evidence gathering process. And we're going to hear from her for about 10 minutes after Alison has spoken for 10 to 15 minutes. And then finally, we'll turn to Lucinda Platt. Lucinda is Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at the London School of Economics and a quantitative sociologist. She's a panel member of the IFS Deaton Review and has been taking the lead in this area. As you can see, as part of the review, we've drawn on many different disciplines, not just economics. It's so essential to do that when you're trying to understand inequality, its drivers, and the possible policy solutions we could turn to address the key concerns about inequality. After Lucinda has spoken, we'll turn to a question and answer session. There's a Slido link that you will see that you can place your questions throughout the presentations. In fact, please do so. And please vote for the questions that you'd like to have asked. I'll keep an eye on those. And the more people vote for a particular question, the higher it gets to the top of the question board. So we have a very exciting event with three great experts in the field to take us through the evidence we've gathered. So let me first turn to Alison to tell us about the report that was launched today. Alison, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard, and to the whole of the panel and for the IFS for putting on this event. I'm really delighted to share with you today, on behalf of the four authors of this chapter, our chapter on gender inequalities in work, which is called Women and Men at Work. And this is joint work with Oriana Bandiera at LSE, Monica Costa Diaz here at IFS and the University of Bristol, and then Camille Landaise, also at LSE. And so the aim of this chapter is to explore the patterns, causes, and consequences of gender inequalities in work in the UK. And by work, I mean both paid work as well as unpaid work. And so the starting point for this review, kind of where we kind of came into this, a year and a half ago, was that we knew that huge gender gaps remain in the UK around work. And so we knew that women were doing the greater share of unpaid work, particularly care work, whilst men were working for pay at higher rates and for longer hours. And also men were better remunerated for every hour of their work, even compared to women who had seemingly kind of equal qualifications. And so this was our starting point. And then what we do in the chapter, and what I'm going to hopefully give you a couple of highlights of today, is we aim to outline the magnitudes, the trends and the patterns of these inequalities, We then dig into the potential causes of them and why they've been so persistent over time. And then we touch on ways forward, in particular relating to the policy environment. And so before I start on that, I want to mention quickly some of the reasons why gender gaps or gender inequalities in work really matter. I'm going to be quite brief here because I know that both Fran and Lucinda are going to touch on this in a lot more detail. But broadly speaking, we can think of gender inequalities in paid work translating very directly into gender inequalities in material living standards, as well as in economic vulnerabilities. And so what we document in the paper is that women on average live in poorer households. Then when women live in households with perhaps a higher earning male partner, they tend to consume a disproportionately low share of household resources. So that is, some of our figures might be masking gender inequalities that are happening within the household. And then we know that low earnings and low experience in the labour market leaves women vulnerable to being economically dependent on men, which might, for example, make it harder to leave an abusive relationship. Then, aside from considerations of material well-being, we also suggest in the chapter that these gender gaps might translate into losses in other forms of well-being. So women might miss out on some of the intrinsic satisfactions of market work or paid work, whilst men might miss out on some of the satisfactions of care work. And then as well, unless we point to the fact that unless there's some reallocation of unpaid work within the home, then we're left with a situation where gains to women's employment come at the expense of women's leisure. And then finally, and I'll come back to this at the very end of the talk, these gender gaps have a large implication for aggregate economic efficiency and growth, since they mean that men's and women's talents are not being kind of used in the parts of the economy where they might be most productive. So we start here with gender gaps in unpaid work. The reason why we start with unpaid work is that we really think, and throughout the chapter discuss, how inequalities in unpaid work underpin and shape much of the inequalities that we then see in the labour market. And so we really can't think about inequalities in the labour market without also thinking about inequalities in unpaid work in the household. So in the UK, women of working age on average do 1.8 hours per day more of unpaid work than their male counterparts. This is sort of towards the middle of the distribution of the OECD, with countries like Scandinavia at the bottom, and then countries in Southern Europe where the distribution of unpaid work is more unequal. We move next to inequalities in paid work. And so in many parts of the chapter, our kind of headline figure here is inequalities in total labour market earnings. So this is the total amount of earnings derived from work that an individual takes home in a given week. And so this is composed of three dimensions: whether individuals work for pay at all, the hours that they work, and then the hourly wage that they gain from that work. And therefore, gender gaps in total earnings is going to be driven by gaps in these three components. And we note in the chapter that these three components often move quite differently. They look quite different for different groups of individuals, and therefore it's really important to think about them both separately and then also how they interact. So here we're plotting gender gaps in total earnings across the OECD. And so you'll find the UK towards the middle of this chart. We have a gender gap of around 40% of total earnings. So that is, women earn on average 40% less per week than the average man. We see the different colours represent the proportion of that gap that can be accounted for by differences in employment, differences in hours worked, and differences in wage rates. And we see that all three components are playing a pretty substantial role in forming the UK's overall gender gap. Here, we start to look at the gender gap over time. So the two blue lines show average earnings over time for men and for women. And then the red line and the axis is on the right-hand side, shows the gender gap as a percentage of male earnings. So, it's gone down over the past 25 years, but if we actually look at the scale here, the level is still pretty remarkable at 40%, and it's essentially only fallen 14% over the past quarter century, 14 percentage points. So, that is a substantial fall. What's happened over this time to cause that? Well, a big thing that's changed in our economy and society is that in around 2010, the average working age woman became more educated than the average working age man. And this is a kind of huge reversal to what we saw before, and therefore in itself could account for quite a substantial portion of the closing of this gap. And so that's what we analyze in the chapter, and we say, after we've accounted for the fact that women have become so much more educated, how does this gap change? And so the red line here is plotting the gap that remains, that cannot be explained by the fact that women have become more educated. And we see that once we account for education, the reduction in the gender gap becomes really very small, at around 3 percentage points in a quarter of a century. We then look how these gaps differ by education. It was always the case, and it still is today, that gender gaps are largest amongst those with the least education, so in green with GCSEs or less. The gender gaps have actually been decreasing a little bit for this group, and a big contributing factor here is the minimum wage legislation. So before we had a minimum wage, more women than men and below what was then the minimum wage, and therefore were kind of boosted by the minimum wage, and then more women than men earn at the minimum wage. So every time that that wage increases, we have a sort of, it contributes towards closing this wage gap a little bit. We don't see any kind of equivalent at the top of the educational distribution. And so amongst graduate men and women, gender gaps have remained very, very constant at about 35% over the past quarter century, and we've seen no movements on any of the three margins. We look in the report at how these things evolve over individuals' lifetimes, and so in green we're plotting for men, and in red for women, and the different lines are different cohorts. We're plotting earnings, employment, hours and wages over a lifetime. And we see that these gender gaps really open up in earnest in individuals sort of mid-20s to 30s. So that might immediately make you think of children. And in fact, we find that children really have everything to do with this huge opening up of the gender gap. And so so here the x-axis is the years since the birth of a first child. So -5 represents 5 years prior to the birth of a first child. 0 is the point at which a first child is born, and 10 is 10 years after. The grey line here represents men's earnings, employment, hours and wages. And we see that men's careers look remarkably unaffected by becoming a parent. Whereas in black, we see that women's earnings, mainly driven by their participation in work and their hours worked, drop off very sharply as soon as they have a first child. And then over time, they lose out in terms of their hourly wage rate as well. And now in the report, we show that this gradual opening up of the hourly wage rate can partially be explained by a kind of accumulation of part-time work or career breaks, meaning that women have less experience on average than men. It can also be explained by the fact that women tend to move into more family-friendly but lower-paying occupations after the birth of a first child. So we think about what why do we see these gaps? Why do we see them opening up around parenthood? And a first hypothesis that we investigate is what economists call comparative advantage. So, is it the case that in in the vast majority of in the majority of heterosexual couples, men may earn a little more upon parenthood than their female partners, and therefore it just makes sort of economic, rational sense for them to keep pursuing their career whilst their partner takes a step back in order to focus on the childcare. So we probe this a little bit by splitting our sample by whether or not the woman in the couple earned more prior to the birth of a first child, or whether or not the man did. And remarkably, we see couples behaving in really, really similar ways, regardless of who earned more. So whoever earned more, we see women taking a larger step back, both in terms of participation and hours of work. We then think about the policy environment, and we have quite a long discussion of this in the chapter, and we discussed that many aspects of the policy environment at the moment do reinforce the status quo. So, for example, parental leave is still very geared towards women taking the greater share of it. We have quite expensive childcare. At the same time, it's also important to bear in mind that often the impacts of policies aiming to increase gender equality have been quite underwhelming. And so we do see a very low take-up of shared parental leave, for example. And in the chapter, we kind of conclude that sort of gendered norms and fixed gendered roles may limit the impacts of new policies. So not at all to say that they're not effective, but some of the financial incentives created by new policies might be dampened by kind of ideas about gendered roles. And so that leads us to the kind of third hypothesis that we study, which is, are these differences driven by sort of traditional gender attitudes about gender roles? And to one extent, kind of yes. It's true that in the UK, 40% of adult men and women agree that a woman should be at home whilst she has children under school age. And we see across the OECD quite high levels of agreement with such statements. Interestingly, there's a lot of variation across countries, and even more interestingly, this variation is very correlated with the gender gaps that open up around childbirth. So on the horizontal axis here is the proportion of the population agreeing with these traditional statements, and up the vertical axis is the penalty associated with women's earnings associated with having children. And so there's a very strong correlation here. But a big point that we make in the report is that these attitudes and social norms, they're really not fixed and they're not immutable. They've changed so much over time, and they tend to keep evolving. And they also evolve in relation to culture, politics, and the policy environment. And in particular, we know that these things often change when a critical mass of people make choices outside of the existing norm. And this, these kind of dynamics really give rise to the idea that ambitious policies might have an outsized impact on gender equality if they are able to both address the financial and practical constraints to gender equality, as well as beginning to shift norms around the sharing of work, and therefore relax some of the other constraints to gender equality. And a final point is that it's often mentioned that a lot of these kind of ambitious policies are quite expensive, and that's true. But what we really highlight in the report is that the economic losses, both to the economy more broadly and also specifically to the taxpayer associated with the status quo, are really enormous. So every time highly qualified women drop out of the labour market who could be doing sort of highly paid roles and paying a lot of tax, that leads to kind of losses for the taxpayer. And therefore, if these policies are successful at putting women's and men's talents to better use, they could even pay for themselves. So that's the end from me, and I'll hand over next to Fran.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alison. And I just want to share my screen. And thank you very much to the IFS Deaton Review of Inequality for allowing me to write a commentary on this, which was challenging, but very satisfying. Just an outline of what I'm going to do, introduce what I said in the commentary, look at labour market issues, because that's obviously central to the report, and gender inequalities within the household, because that is very much what I work on, and implications for policy. And then I'll conclude. I think I may not have done this from the beginning, so I'll do that now. Oh, no. Sorry, I've lost my slide. I'll go on as I am, I think. What I did was to write a social policy perspective on gendered economic inequalities in the UK. And this was from not just a social policy perspective, but also gender analysis, because of my membership of the Women's Budget Group, which Richard mentioned. And this also means that this applies to men too, because gender shouldn't be seen as just something for women, with men seen as a norm which is not gendered, if you like. So it does involve men as well. And I say we should bring men in more. And this gender analysis means that both individual autonomy and interdependence and caring are seen as central to that analysis. And that when we're looking at distribution, we should look not just at a household at a point in time, but the individual over the life course. In other words, beyond working age as well, and the individual as well as the household. And therefore look at the implications of policies for roles, relationships and resources in the longer term, and not just the immediate household at the point in time. And this means looking as well, as Alison did, at within household resource distribution, which is often instead put in the too difficult box. And this means that other institutions are responsible for distribution as well as the market, obviously the state, but also the family both distributes and redistributes resources within it. I'm going to look at lower income and social security in particular, because social policy is particularly interested in those, and I'll argue that what I'm saying is relevant to the Deaton Review of Inequalities as a whole. So looking at labour market issues briefly, because obviously that was covered comprehensively by Alison and her colleagues, Rubery and Figueiredo say women are more integrated in the UK labour market today, or at least that's the central question that we should be addressing, but this has got trade-offs. So one of these trade-offs is that there is now more activation in a flexible labour market, a labour market whose nature has changed, and there is more conditionality which has been ratcheted up, including in particular affecting women in recent years, in a labour market whose nature is changing, including more self-employment, of course. Another trade-off is that there is no right to individual income in our new means-tested universal credit, despite that conditionality. So there isn't a quid pro quo of a right to individual income, because it's just one payment per household. And another trade-off is doubts about whether there are enough obligations on others to shape a labour market which is friendly to those who are caring, and a labour market and other provisions as well, of course. So what kinds of implications does this analysis have? Well, social protection for self-employed people is important, and a lot of women have come into self-employment in recent years, and this is often forgotten. It's often a forgotten element of both labour market and social protection analysis. But of course, for employees, there's the good work agenda, which is still to be fulfilled in the employment bill that's forthcoming. Public sector employment is important because women often get their opportunities for training and promotion within that. Seeing caring as an investment for all rather than just a matter of private choice. And I would add less emphasis on means-tested benefits in our social security system. So the report looks at the motherhood penalty, and you can see this as a loss of human capital on the one hand, but you can also see it as a lot of women working below their potential, partly because they're investing in other people's human capital, although I don't suppose many would see it that way. But also, as Alison emphasised, unpaid work is important, and it may affect women's ability to progress in the labour market as well as to actually participate. And one thing we might think about is whether the skills that are developed in unpaid work are recognised or valued enough in the labour market. Colleagues and I have been doing research on universal credit recently, and a lot of the women in particular in the couples we researched, really there seemed to be no let up in the domestic labour that they were doing, which was not just care, but also looking after the household budget and also looking after the universal credit claim. And this means quite a lot of work because of the income insecurity, in particular for those in employment, that universal credit appears to create for many. And this means, of course, a poverty of time and a degree of responsibility for those people doing those tasks, which may, as I say, affect their progression in work. Another issue I wanted to highlight was care for disabled and elderly people, because this often is not given as much analytical or policy attention as care for children is, even though, if anything, it's more of a policy failure in the UK and in some other countries. This means paid leave and right to flexibility for carers in employment is important, as well as improvement in policies for childcare. And it's especially important, I think, with the increase in women's pension age, the ageing population, and the increase in the numbers of disabled people who, thankfully, are living longer on average than they used to. So what about gender inequalities within the household, which I said I wanted to look at, partly because my current research focuses on couples, and I want to interrogate the default reference point of the household as a stable unit of pooling and sharing, as Sophie Pontier puts it. And this applies to income. I'm going to look at that in particular, but also to time, as I've been talking about, and also to assets. I mean, including the family car, for example. And resources are not always shared fairly in couples. We know that by now. We also know, however, that money isn't necessarily neutral or always completely fungible. In other words, the source and the owner of money may give it different meanings within the household. And I would want to stress the importance of individual autonomy and agency. This doesn't mean free-floating individualism, just in case anybody thinks it might, but it's the kind of autonomy and agency that's necessary for healthy relationships, in fact, rather than individualism. And we need to acknowledge that economic dependence, as Alison said, can be problematic. And of course, financial coercion has been recognised as a form of domestic abuse in recent legislation. This means policy assessment needs to include the impact on intra-household inequalities as far as we can do that. And the IFS has very much tried to do that in some of its work. But policy debates, I think, are often clouded by the use of workless households, in-work poverty, hard-working families, work-rich versus work-poor households, and so on. Whereas instead, we need to consider individuals within the household context as well. That doesn't mean saying that individuals should be responsible for their own welfare, because given the recognition of interdependence and caring responsibilities, we can never see that as something which will work properly for those with caring responsibilities. But it does mean we need to consider the individual in their household context. So what implications does that have for policy? Well, social policy sees norms and policies as embedded in one another. So I wanted to look at policy a bit. I think this may be changing, as Alison said. The joint means test for universal credit, for example, was seen as unfair when people applied in the pandemic, particularly by young couples. And our own research on universal credit appears to suggest that gender roles are becoming more fluid within low-income families included. Non-means tested benefits, of course, don't depend on a partner's presence, a partner's resources, or a partner's actions, but they've been neglected recently. So we had to, for example, invent furlough during the pandemic. And women have been caught in a pincer movement as the dependence additions to these non-means tested benefits have been abolished on the one hand, but contribution conditions have been tightened for these benefits on the other. Not maternity allowance, I should say. The Labour government made that easier to qualify for, but the other contributory benefits, which we don't hear very much about anymore. And my argument would be that we should improve these individual non-means tested benefits, both in terms of the conditions and their amounts, and that income for unpaid carers shouldn't depend on benefits for the person being cared for. And ironically, also, this would help to tackle so-called in-work poverty, because benefits for out-of-work partners could add to the income of the couple as a whole. We need to improve incentives for second earners and more flexible conditionality, especially for parents and people who are caring. And this means reforms in universal credit. And I would also say the abolition of the transferable tax allowance and the high income child benefit charge as well, which are to some extent household based. There's a long gap in the UK between well-paid leave for parents and access to free or affordable childcare. The International Leave Network has shown that. And in order to have high parental leave take up by men, this needs to be well paid and it needs to be reserved for them. Use it or lose it, as that is sometimes called. And that could be one of the radical policies that Alison talked about at the end. In terms of our childcare system, it's well known for its complexity, the high cost of childcare, which of course isn't included in the poverty measure. So we could continue to expand the free provision, which can be a financial incentive to work. And we could perhaps look also at more supply side and less demand side subsidies for that childcare that is not free. But any rebalancing of subsidy to low-income families, I would argue, shouldn't just be paid for by other families with children. So these are just some pointers to a needful change in direction. They're not a comprehensive programme. The Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, which was set up by the Women's Budget Group and reported in 2020, the chair said we need to go beyond the gender pay gap to the economy as a whole, including the unpaid economy, as the report does. And we need to go beyond growth and breaking the glass ceiling to a better life for all. And I would argue social policy helps us to do that. And gender analysis helps us to have a combination of a focus on autonomy and agency for all, with more awareness through gender analysis of interdependence as both society and the wider world, as the Commission said. And this means, I think, that gender issues must be central to the Deaton Review, not just for their own sake, but also in that broader context. Thank you very much. Lucinda's now going to say something.
Thank you, Fran. Hello all. So yes, I'm going to now just offer some commentary on the report and the related contributions. So I want to start by sort of noting that the 1970s saw the introduction of both equal pay and sex discrimination legislation. At that time, women were starting to make gains in educational attainment that reached a sort of culmination in 2010, as Alison noted, when the educational attainment of women surpassed that of men. Women had also won control of their fertility through the Abortion Act of 1967 and the extension of the prescription of the pill beyond married women in that same year. They were entering paid work in larger numbers and were making gains across employment sectors, traditionally the preserve of men. But as we've seen, 50 years on, we still see marked inequalities across multiple domains of men's and women's lives. These have been scrutinised in the chapter by Alison and her colleagues, in the extended commentary offered by Fran, as well as in a further commentary provided by Lynn Prince-Cook, and a paper by Claudia Goldin, Sarah Pekka-Lacker and Claudia Olivetti, which were also prepared for the Deaton Review on this topic. Alison focused on the working age population of those 20 to 55-year-olds not in education. She outlined changes both over the 25-year period since 1995 and in working men's and women's individual and family lives, bringing to sharp relief the stubborn persistence of the earnings gap. So as she said, despite some reduction over the 25 years from around 53% to around 40% as an earnings gap, the authors show enduring inequalities in the division of domestic and market, or in paid and unpaid work, and in particular in childcare, and that this keeps the earnings gap high. Moreover, to the extent that the earning gaps has reduced, they show that that can be largely explained by women's increasing qualifications, both in absolute terms and relative to men. Since more qualified women are more likely to be in work more hours, and have higher hourly pay than lower qualified women, the decreases in the earnings gap can then be seen as predominantly a mechanical consequence of these changes in women's educational profiles, leaving little role for either policy or for wider equalising forces in society or in changing social context to account for the decline we've seen. Since women cannot go on indefinitely gaining education, and since the gaps in hourly paid rates rather than in hours or participation are largest for more qualified women, this earnings gap is then unlikely to resolve itself just given time. Central to Alison's account of the drivers of pay gaps are the way these emerge over the life course, and specifically on having a child. Employment, or for those who stay in work, hours drop off at this point, and the wage gap gets steadily bigger as experience doesn't keep up, or the types of jobs which facilitate flexibility do not offer the same chances of progression. And as she showed, given that this happens regardless of whether the father or the mother is the higher earning couples, the analysis again suggests that these gaps will not fix themselves simply as women increasingly gain a foothold in higher paying jobs and careers. Alison and her colleagues point to the need to shift gender norms and for a policy environment that does not reinforce the responsibilities of women to participate in caring work and for men to participate in paid work. For example, as currently we see that generous maternity leaves paid only to mothers or paid primarily to mothers do reinforce those gender divisions. Instead, they seek ambitious policies that foster a comprehensive shift in the typical roles of both men and women. And they argue that such generous policies could pay them for themselves if there's less wasted potential of women and of men. These themes were pursued in Fran Bennett's commentary. She draws attention to the ways in which households are not necessarily sites of equal sharing of economic resources any more than they're sites of equal sharing of unpaid work. This raises questions about how we evaluate the economic well-being of men and women when they're living together. At the same time, in poorer households, control of resources and the challenges of managing on a low income may be as much of a burden as a benefit. And I think this is a point that's often neglected and one she makes strongly. For Fran, we need to not only pay attention to the ways in which the social security system and flexible working is disadvantageous for women, but also consider how better to support independence and autonomy for those with caring roles, whether or not they have a partner. And that we also need to increase the incentives for so-called second earners so that women are not constrained in seeking financial autonomy. Fran also extends a consideration of the life course, both by drawing attention to later life economic inequalities, but also bringing our attention to caring responsibilities for older as well as younger relatives. So for older kin, not just children, not just childcare. This elder caring burden is typically, again, carried by women rather than men, and it may kick in just as women's responsibility for their children diminishes, potentially inhibiting a fuller return to work and to the workplace and its rewards as their children become more independent. This return to greater participation in work after the children have become more independent is the focus of Golden, Olivetti and Kerr's paper, which investigates longer trajectories, post-childrearing, for college-educated men and women in the US. The authors wanted to see if mothers were able to catch up once they had completed the most onerous years of bringing up children. And they did find that mothers increased their participation in these later years and did catch up with other women, so non-mothers, but not with fathers. Fathers established a large and enduring gap. And for me, these findings suggest that the gender norms that lead mothers to undertake the lion's share of both childcare and domestic work also shape the lives of non-mothers. So we can't attribute everything to the motherhood penalty. Instead, there are gender norms which extend, and these gender norms which shape those differences, and these extend well beyond the economic sphere, and they extend to wider gender inequalities. And some of these are picked up by Lynn Prince-Cook in her commentary. She discusses how the allocation of differential status and hence high rewards leads to legitimization of these differences, both by those with a higher and lower position in the hierarchy, or by men gaining higher rewards and women who are gaining lower rewards. This results in a vicious cycle where the roles of lower status groups are less rewarded. So we think of the differential valuation of what are seen as women's jobs compared to men's jobs. And then the lower rewards, in turn, maintain their lower status. Such hierarchies of status can also be found in the ways that power and violence are used to enforce the status hierarchy. We know that in the UK, a woman is killed by a man every 3 days on average. In nearly 2/3 of these cases, the man is a partner or an ex-partner. Lack of representation of women in positions of power and authority, also outlined by Cook, can have consequences for the status hierarchy in addition, and also for political willingness to address gendered inequalities. So what's the solution to all this bad news? So I think there's a commonality across the accounts of the various papers, which indicates the need for the transformation of gender norms and expectations, and for how we value care relative to other forms of work. To enable change, there needs to be a focus on institutional arrangements that not only enable women to enter the labour force, for example, through well-funded and comprehensive childcare, but also enable men to undertake caring roles. As Cook points out, enhancing men's caring roles also could have the potential to undermine the role of violence in the power hierarchy. Until we can support men to care, for example, by well-funded specific paternity leave that can just be taken by fathers, as well as by supporting women to take on increasing career responsibilities through high-quality, well-remunerated childcare, children will grow up seeing and absorbing the gendered roles that are enacted around them, and will value care and other forms of paid work as they are valued in society. To change that for the next generation is our challenge. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Richard and all the other speakers for the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Alison, Fran, and Lucinda. That was really incredible. It's exciting, a little depressing, but extremely challenging. By the way, do keep asking your questions in Slido. We have 15 minutes and I'll go through some of those. Just to point out that these reports are on the Deaton Review website at IFS, so please do read them carefully. As you see, there's a huge amount in them. And if you didn't think it before, you can see already the value of drawing from leading experts from different disciplines in trying to get understand what's going on with inequalities, especially in gender, and what we might do about them. And just to follow up on Fran's point, this is absolutely key across the whole of the Deaton Review and in many other areas that we're covering, specific areas, whether it be about the labour market, about families. Of course, these are going to be central, but we still felt, and I think it's been wholly justified, that we needed a study and commentaries in this area on its own. And I'm going to, well, sitting here, I was thinking at UCL, you know, at one point I did think education was the answer, but it certainly is not enough. And we've seen that. And that's what, in a sense, is so depressing, but yet so challenging. There's an awful lot for us to do and for us to understand. One thing before I go to the questions, just back to where Alison started. We had a cross-country look at gender gaps, and I was rather shocked to see something that comes up in many areas of inequality, and that is a country like Finland seems to do extremely well, and other countries, I think at the other end, at the group that Alison had, was Japan, and one immediately thinks of have we got lessons we can learn from these? So maybe I could just briefly get you, Alison, perhaps, to reflect if you think there are things to learn from other countries. I think often, and I felt this right the way through this COVID pandemic as well, we tend to be very inward looking in the UK and not look for solutions and experiences elsewhere. And the Deaton Review is a comparative review, not just it's about the UK, but we want to learn from what's worked and what hasn't worked in other societies and economies. So maybe, Alison, you might reflect on that, and I'll turn to some of the other questions. Of course, if Lucinda and Fran want to jump in as well, please do.
Absolutely. So I think what's common across a number of the Scandinavian countries, that all have some of the lowest gender gaps, and they also have a kind of package of family policies that all push in the same direction of trying to directly incentivize men to take a greater caring role. And so they have these use it or lose it months, as both Fran and Lucinda mentioned, that is dedicated time that can only be taken by fathers and cannot be transferred back to the mothers. And when these months were brought in, they weren't at the expense of mothers' maternity leave. And so, like that really kind of, and these sort of policies are what really starts to kind of push at changing the norms. And that's what we mean by kind of outsized effects or kind of multiplier effects, that you get this sort of effect that's driven by a kind of financial incentive from a new policy. But then if that kind of changes the behavior of a critical mass of people, then you might also start to see changes in attitudes and norms. And another thing that I would add is, like we do see across countries that exactly it's these countries that have these sort of ambitious policies, they have the lowest gender gaps, they also have the most progressive attitudes, they all kind of come together. And something we really highlight in the chapter is that some of these policies, we would expect the effects of them to kind of, they grow over time if they end up changing the norms, and therefore they might be a little difficult to evaluate exactly what's coming from, exactly what impact is coming from that policy, because they grow over time. So I think this, exactly as you say, the cross-country comparisons can be really useful here.
Okay, let me, we've got a huge number of questions coming in actually, and I've got one that I'm going to come back to at the end, so I'll get you thinking about that. And that is the rather challenge and obvious one perhaps, and that is, can we have any confidence that things will change in any kind of reasonable time frame? I suppose at the review we hope we can have some influence, and there is a time frame out there, but that's a question I'm going to come back to at the end, but we've got a little more time before I need to do that. I was going to raise one that's rather like Fran's point across the review, and that is, what about the intersectionality? And are gender barriers more constraining in certain demographic groups, race, religion, age? Because that's controversial and challenging, but I think we do need to think about that head on. And I wondered if one of you, perhaps Fran, you'd like to say something on that. And I know Lucinda's been very involved in part of the review that's been dealing with ethnicity. Is there some intersection here that's going to be useful to look at and learn from?
I think that's a absolutely essential point, and one which I should say I probably didn't do enough in my presentation just now to include, although intersectionality of class and income and security in particular, I think mustn't be forgotten about. So we have to remember that aspect of intersectionality as well. But the others that you mentioned are, of course, absolutely critical. And I would pay tribute to Lucinda in particular for trying to bring together gender and ethnicity in the past. And of course, you sometimes have to do that kind of thing using using several years of data, because you may not have the numbers in the groups that you want to look at. I would also pay tribute to my colleague Mary Daly from the University of Oxford, who's just written a book on gender and intersectionality looking across the European Union. So yes, it's absolutely critical. I don't want to say much more than that because we haven't got a huge amount of time, but that's very important, and we should emphasize it more.
Lucinda, did you want to add?
Yes, could I just add to that? Yeah, I think it's really important to look at these differences and look at these different barriers. I mean, a lot of attention is often paid to differences in labour market participation by women of different ethnic groups. But I think there's much more to get to the kind of heart of what is driving that. It's easy to make sort of very simplistic assumptions that these are culturally driven or attitudes driven. But I think we can also learn from looking more closely at them. So, for example, I did some work which showed that, yes, there are differences in sort of gender role attitudes across ethnic groups, but these don't really help very much to explain these differences in participation patterns. What some other work has shown is that actually, if you look at whether people's mothers or indeed their mother-in-laws, women's mother-in-laws worked, that can help to understand quite a lot about patterns. So we can see how these are sort of intergenerational processes which apply more generally, but that by looking at ethnicity, they can shed particular light on. And I suppose the other thing I would say, which picks up on Fran's point about how looking at the sort of lower income raises different issues, we do have to also think about what the kind of trade-offs are, particularly for low-income families where they may be facing particular rates of discrimination in the labour market, and whether the costs of participating are actually greater than the benefits under those circumstances if they're facing high discrimination, high unemployment rates, and can't necessarily get the access to the jobs which would give them the rewards that make it a kind of a sensible, logical decision. So I think that brings us back to the points about autonomy and economic independence as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a little bit of a nerdy thing going on in the questions as well, but I think it's an important one because you keep coming back to norms and attitudes, but are we really, there's a question about do we really measure them well, and how should we think about that? Let me put it a bit more generally. How should we reflect on, how should we measure, and how should we reflect on norms and attitudes? And there's a question down there that asks, well, what do women want from work after childbearing? And in a sense, to me, that tends to tie into what we think about norms and beliefs. Perhaps you could just say a little word about where we are in kind of measuring these norms and beliefs, and whether you think we're really getting at the heart of this in the surveys that we have. But Alison, do you want to say a word on that? I know you've worked on other countries on norms.
Yeah, so I think there's always a kind of trade-off here between how kind of deep you go and then how comparable across time and across contexts and countries. And so the work that we showed in the chapter, I agree that in some ways they're a little simplistic questions. They're quite sort of old-fashioned, the way they're worded around just a woman should stay at home. But the big advantage is that we have this data across countries and over time. And the fact that these measures are really correlated with gender gaps across countries does tell us that it's picking something up. Like these are meaningful questions to people. I think it's always important to think about, what considerations are respondents thinking about when they're answering these questions. And for that question around women should stay at home while their kids are small, it's certainly the case that if you have very good quality free childcare, that's going to affect the way you answer that question, because the choice is different. So it is going to pick up things other than sort of intrinsic preferences. But I think more broadly, what we try and do is to kind of move away from the idea that that it makes sense in the context of gender to think about intrinsic preferences, that the way we think about these roles is of course contingent on everything in a very, very complex way, and that we can get glimpses of that by kind of eliciting different types of attitudes. On the question about what do women want from workplaces, so there is a load of really interesting new work showing that women have a greater preference for flexibility, for shorter commutes. Like all of this stuff could be really important in explaining why these gender gaps open up, because in practice then women are left with trading off a higher paying job versus a job that can give them more of these attributes. I think though it's, like, this is why it's really important to kind of always be considering gender inequality within the home, because even the question, what do women want, it kind of presumes that it needs to be women who are constantly juggling the childcare, and therefore it's not just sort of innately to women that they want flexibility. Women need flexibility if they're responsible for also doing all the childcare. And so I think maybe moving forward, it's useful to kind of think about what do people want who also juggle caring responsibilities, and whether they be men or women.
Yeah, I'm sure we could go on. Juggling seems to be, it's a really complicated thing to do, juggling. I've never mastered it. And it seems that, when listening to you all, the kind of organisation, not just of work, but of family life, and in some sense, the caring responsibilities across the life course among older parents and your children, which seems to fall on women. And there was a very interesting question about commuting, and I think we've all got more aware of the geography of work and the geography of inequality, and that we all know, if you have young children, or those of us who've had young children, being close to home is incredibly valuable. And I wondered, is there just a quick one before I go to the final question? How should we think about that? That seems more than just an organization of work and home life. It's almost an organization of the geography of work. Is anybody would like, Fran, you're nodding. Do you want to take up on that?
Just a quick intervention, because I did mention it in the commentary, which is partly about transport. And I think the problem of climate change actually, in a sense, is ironically rather helpful to this, because it may mean that we think more about public transport and other ways of commuting than just getting the private car out. So I think that could be quite helpful. And there has been some work on this in terms of how much time is taken up, particularly if you've got children, about taking them to childcare, getting them back from childcare, going to your work, getting back from your work, and so on, particularly if you've got several children. So the report focused on 10 years from the birth of the first child, I think. But if you've got several children, Christine Skinner, for example, did a lovely article in the Journal of Social Policy some time ago with little stick people showing what trajectories you had to do during the day in order just to live, basically. So shopping, childcare, work, all has to be done. And I think it's Anne Green who's called this trip chaining. So we need to do something about trip chaining, in particular for people with caring responsibilities. I agree that that would be incredibly important. And it also relates to planning and development and the location of housing and mixed housing and the availability of facilities within geographical areas.
Incredibly fantastic. We're coming close to the end. I notice it's just an enormous conversation going on in Slido as well, and it's really nice. By the way, we had a very nice comment from Lynn Price Cook, who's, as Lucinda said, has written one of the commentaries. Thanks, Lynn, pointing out that in fact you can change norms, and indeed it's very challenging for economists to think about changing norms and changing preferences, which is exactly why we need other disciplines and other thinkers to think that through. And it's important across the whole of the inequalities debate, and I think particularly here how policies and of course education, other things change attitudes. But we're down to the last minute on a wonderful occasion. Let me just ask you very quickly, you've got just 20 seconds each to reflect on the most giant of all questions, and that is, can we have any confidence that things will change in any kind of reasonable time frame? Lucinda, let me get you to say something on that first.
So I'm not hugely confident that about the reasonable time change. I think we can change things. I mean, as Lynn said, we can change norms, but more than that, we need to change behaviours, because change begets change. And I think that's really the focus. And it also comes back to this question about, how we're measuring norms. Well, we're measuring norms by what we see in society. As long as the assumption is that we need to kind of fix transport for women, but not for men, then we're continuing to perpetuate these gendered norms. So anything we can do to shift those expectations so that we get change in behaviour will then pass on to the next generation. But I'm afraid I'm thinking that it's probably going to be the next generation and ours that will see this.
Fran?
I think Lynn's point was incredibly important, so I just wanted to reinforce that. So attitudes and norms can change, partly with the experience of policies as well. And I think that may be happening with the free childcare for 3 and 4 year olds, in particular the 15 hours that doesn't depend on earnings and employment now, in fact. And as I said, I think that can be an incentive for, quotes, second earners to work. Another one I would say, which has been found, is the experience of having independent income as a lone parent and what that means for future partnership. So my colleague in the University of Bath, Rita Griffiths, did her PhD about lone parents and whether they and whether there was an influence of the joint means test on their decisions about partnering. And yes, there was. They quite liked having the experience of independent income, thank you very much. And if they went in with a new partner who was earning, then the joint means test might very well mean that they didn't have any income themselves after that, apart from child benefit, thank goodness. So I think it's important to say that the policies, it's iterative, if you like, policies, norms, and norms and policies.
Thanks very much. I very much like your idea of contributory individual type benefits operating in this way, which I must say is good, and I hadn't thought of that before. That's
and non-contributory
nice
as well, I should say.
Sure.
Carers allowance is non-contributory and is also important.
Yeah. Okay. And lastly, to Alison, the author of the great report that we've heard quite a bit about. Alison.
I think I would just end by saying, these things aren't going to change on their own. So we often hear stats like, 100 years to close the gender gap. This stuff isn't just a time trend. It evolves when policy evolves and when social change happens. And there's no reason to expect a particular kind of trend to continue in the future. It's all going to depend on what happens kind of in policy and in society more generally. So
thanks very much. As you said, just seems we're missing as a society such a trick here in terms of economic productivity and the well-being of society generally, just not fixing this. And it's one of these things, we need a COP for this. In fact, we need a COP for many things about the inequality challenges, just a bit of a more longer term view of how we're going to fix these things, looking at our own society, but across others too. And I hope the review can contribute to that. So thanks so much to Lucinda, Fran, Alison and co-authors and the other contributors in this area of the review, which I said is launched today, and you'll see the other commentaries and papers there, so please look at them. There's already several that we've had on trade, on philosophy, on ethics, on attitudes, and please keep an eye out for that. The next events from the Inequality Review will happen in the new year, so keep an eye out for those. And thanks to you all for being here, and thanks to the audience for being here. And sorry we couldn't cover all the many questions, but I know this debate will continue. And in fact, the review has a couple more years with evidence gathering now, as you see, and then the panel, which includes Lucinda, will have to reflect on that and come up with some answers, or at least some really key ideas here. And this has been very, very useful in that process. So thanks again to you all, and look forward to reading more and discussing this further with you. Thank you and goodbye.